All right, going live.
All right, I'm gonna try to switch over to Bluetooth.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking some time in the middle of the profitability of your day to sit down with Terry and I as we talk about the work of an evangelist and try to do our very best to improve, to encourage, to exhort men who are interested in the work of spreading the gospel. And Terry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Phil. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing all right. I think you're getting a little feedback. You might want to check into that on your uh,
Well,
device right there, but it'll pop out in a second. It should clear up. Um,
hopefully it's
s-
clear up. Is that sounding better yet? Let me know if I need to turn these
the
off.
echo's gone, so I think maybe there's audio echo that was taking place.
All
Um,
right, good.
so one of the things of the three layers we're looking at for today, we'll get right to the brass tacks of things, is talking about communication again. We've talked about it in the past in a couple different ways. Process of developing material, figuring out what you're going to say, dealing with difficult subjects, sometimes subjects that are emotionally challenging and spiritually challenged. And we had a couple questions that came into us related to that we're going to try to um, really get a good understanding about. And so we've got three areas we're going to break down, and we'll go ahead and just list those out, and then we'll circle the wagons back around and talk about them. But when it comes to delivery and understanding, there are a couple things that are really important. One of them is taking complex things and finding ways to make it simple. Second thing is to look at the things that are actually simple and keeping them that way. And then something that I think is really important and isn't always um, done in the way that causes the message to stick. Uh, Sticky messages are a thing that I think are really important, is making application, giving space and context for the 21st century Christian to take a first century text, a first century message, and live it and really understand it well in their service and their glorification of God in their work. And so those are at least the core principles that Terry and I are going to break down. To be specific, one of the questions we have, and that really starts off our first point, had to do with um, the language we use in the sense of, let's just say, the language of the academic or the scholar and the conversationalist. And so, Terry, uh, why don't we go ahead and break into that? And you can give us a couple of your thoughts that way. I know we joked about this earlier before the broadcast started as to your approach to that, but I think there's some serious thought processes that we can go through to kind of think through audience message reception.
Yeah, so for those who haven't figured out, Phil is the smart one between the two of us.
That's a lie.
And
Smart
so
Alec.
what what that really means is talking above people's heads has never been my problem. I in fact I may sometimes when I try to be academic, I probably still make it sound really dumb, which maybe is a good thing. And I'll say this too, that when I hope everybody knows this, you have to approach different audiences, different formats in different ways. So and this should be simple kind of understanding. Um, I teach adult classes probably 75% of the time. But when I step out of adult classes, it's usually to a junior high or high school class. If I if I'm teaching my junior high classes the same way I'm teaching my adult classes, that's a fail on my part. Um, but then when I'm preaching, I've got junior high kids in there that I want them to actually grasp. And so I think you would agree with this, Phil, that my classes are more in depth and have probably a lot more weightier stuff in that than my preaching does. So because, and that doesn't mean that the preaching doesn't have in depth. It is harder. It is harder to present a sermon that can connect to those varying levels of people. So taking the complex and making it simple I think one of the ways we kind of do some of that, and I'll give some maybe real life examples for me. I'm not a language guy, but I have a Greek dictionary, so that makes me a language guy in some people's
Incredibly
minds.
dangerous.
Yeah. Um, I don't ever quote or try to say, and I won't say ever, almost never, very rarely will you hear me utter a Greek or Hebrew word in a sermon. That doesn't mean, though, that that doesn't play a role in my understanding and preparation of the text. So I might say something like, now this word in the original language means this, to make that application in a sermon. That's commonly how I would handle that. And then really strive to make that simplified in a way they understand. I'm afraid sometimes when we get up there and we go, well, the Greek word, pick one. I don't even know a Greek word off the top of my head, so that's how little I know. That's Phil's department. But you say it, and then it's like, which means this, and you know, I've heard guys preach before and go, well, this is the present, past participle, future tense of the word, which means, and I'm sitting there. By the way, this is what I do, right? So I should listen to those guys a little bit more in depthly for tips and that kind of stuff. But when you start doing that stuff, especially from the pulpit, you lose me, and I'm more interested than most of the members. So when we talk about taking the complex and making it simple, I think that's a good illustration for me, Phil, about maybe how we take the complex and make it way too complex. Our job is to take something like that, where this word has a significant meaning, and present it in such a way that isn't difficult to understand and doesn't confuse people, and to make it so simple that somebody who doesn't have a college education, for example, can understand what I'm saying. And you're putting the quote there, the tag there about the Mr. Rogers rules for talking to children, and I was telling you in the book Tipping Point by Gladwell that I've been reading for a while. There's a whole section on stickiness, and it goes into great detail about Sesame Street and how much research they put into making things stick visually, interactually. You know, the original Sesame Street, for instance, never had cross interaction between the Muppets and humans, because the psychologists of the day said that was too confusing for kids. They would blend fantasy and reality. You shouldn't do that. So one of the examples is when they tested that out, they found out that when the Muppets were on the screen, the kids paid attention, and when it was just the humans, which is the street scenes, the kids completely left it. They had nothing to do with that. And so that's how Sesame Street broke the rules, by the way, of the psychologists of the day, the child experts, and blended fantasy and reality, and that created the model for Sesame Street. And so part of this is, along the way of preaching, you're going to have to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And let me say this, and I've rambled enough, and you can get into Mr. Rogers stuff. I think one of the keys of this is sometimes preachers are their own worst enemy, that we decide this is how this needs to be done, and we kind of dig our feet in, and we get stubborn. And somebody may come to us and go, hey, I appreciate what you're doing there, but that was just too difficult to understand. You got to work on making that more simple. And we might kind of get noble about the fact of, well, if they don't have time for the original language, these people just aren't very sincere Bible students. Don't do that. Don't be that way. That's a dangerous thing in this area of kind of over complicating things. People don't care how smart you are in the pulpit, and that's not your job, is to prove them how intelligent you are. Your job is to help them see the text in a way that affects their life. So you got to take these really, really hard things, and you got to make them easy enough. My target's always been about junior high, by the way. That doesn't mean that all my sermons are junior high level. That means I've got something from junior high to well-skilled. I've got a broad range of saying things and trying to make applications on a broad range, so that people can understand that. Some that are younger, some that are older, babes in Christ, warriors of the cross, all in between. every sermon has to try to touch them in some way if you're going to do this work effectively. So that's kind of my rambling about all of that. I don't know if that makes much sense, but talk about
Well,
Mr. Rogers.
here's we're going to get the rest of Rogers here in a second. Here's something that I want to make sure everyone understands that's listening, especially the young preachers. Effective communication is stupid hard. And I said it that way intentionally. Um, it is incredibly difficult to craft a message that reaches that whole basket of listeners. And Terry and I in the future, I don't know if we'll probably talk a little bit about it in this broadcast, but we're going to talk about how to listen to a sermon as well. We're hinting at some of those things today. And a couple layers of full disclosure. Terry talks about me being the smart one. That's debatable, but I am wordy, and I know that.
It's all relative.
Yeah, well, I picked on Terry.
Older, so.
Yeah. I do have a very big word basket. And unfortunately, I love to churn through it and reuse those words that no one's spoken aloud in 300 years. And so that is a known fact and a challenge about who I am. I talk the same way in the pulpit as I do with my family and my friends. And sometimes they look at me and say, was that a word? And the answer is, yes, it is. And they check and they say, yeah, it is, but nobody uses that anymore. So this is the reason I bring that up. It's not a great advantage all the time. It's a skill that I have to pull the lever back on and remember that my audience didn't read the same dictionaries that I did growing up, because I literally read dictionaries. And so, whatever. So that's a thing that's important. And I can lose people in the audience. Like Terry talks about losing people when you use Greek. I think you can use Greek in a sermon effectively if you have a really good understanding of the language, more than just, and I'll just speak very plainly, more than just 2 years out of college taking a great college level introduction to Greek may not be enough to equip you to use Greek effectively in teaching. And I'll say teaching now more than just sermons.
And here's what's funny about that. Let me say this, Phil. What I find funny about that is my good close friends that have that advanced years of Greek, and some of them that teach Greek, the ones that I know, they hardly ever use it in their sermons the way guys that only have 1 or 2 years of Greek have.
Yeah.
And that's what I always find funny is that the guys that are more skilled and have the ability to do that, they don't. For this very reason. By the way, sorry to interrupt, but on the vocabulary thing, the guy that I think had the most expansive vocabulary that I've listened to, and probably you too, is probably D. Bowman. Dude, there were words that D would say in his sermons. I had no clue what they meant when he said them. But now one of the things he always did, and I don't know if you do this, but D always put them in a triad. He would always do synonyms of those words, and he would start off with a synonym, then he'd use the word you don't know, and then he'd follow up with like a synonym or a clause that explains it. And so he said the same thing 3 different ways, which, by the way, is one of the major ways to improve your stickiness, is to repeat it in ways that are not exactly the same. And by the time D got done with that thought, you didn't know that word, but you knew what he was saying.
Yeah. I do the exact same thing.
And that was and that's the way to take, I figured you did, that's the way to take this complex word and make it simple, and nobody leaves confused. And so you're still allowed to use your vocabulary as long as you do it in such a way that doesn't confuse anybody. That is like one of the perfect examples of that, I think. If you're doing that, and I know D did, that's exactly what we're talking about here in that sense.
Right. This is getting kind of the practical side. So let's talk about complexity of language, and then we'll talk about complexity of text. Let's say you've got a Greek word, hysterion, baptizo, doesn't matter. Just pick any Greek word. And you now know what it means. And I'm saying you really know the elasticity of the word. And to understand the stretchiness of the word, you've taken the time to see how quality translations use it. Say, this is the word that's used to translate these same Greek words out of the Old Testament, or out of the Old Testament using the Septuagint, and they use it in this variety of words. Now I can grapple with it, and I've got all of that. One great way to use it is never actually use the word, because
Right.
you work from the definitions that you have now basketed together, and you're showing the concept. And you can say the concept is found when God says this, and here's the word that we're focusing in on today. And you're using the English translation of the word, and the concept is seen again here, and the concept is seen again here, and then the New Testament, the concept is seen again here, and then finally your application comes at the end. And if you want to, you can highlight that this is all the same word family. I rarely will use the term specifically the same word, because the translation process from the biblical languages into modern languages um, is messy. But word
Yeah.
family is the term I tend to use as an accommodative term to talk about past, present, to talk about endings, to talk all that as a basket, as a thing that's here's the meal. Um, so
And I
that's
usually say something about the root word,
yeah,
and again, for instance, in Job, there's 7 times the same word is used, the same word family or root word is used. 6 times it's translated one way, but the translators translated it a different way at the end of the book. And so when I deal with that, it's similar to what you're saying. We went through and read all 7 passages, and I would point out, okay, this word in the English is the same root word as this word in the English over here, just to tie that together in every place. And I did all of that without ever saying the word to what you're saying there.
yeah. So
Yeah,
this is like one tip to take an edge of things off. So that's like language issues.
right.
But then we've got other stuff going on, and we're going to get to Rogers here in about 2 seconds, where you have complex messages from Paul, from Jesus, from the prophets, and we're actually we might even bring in a particularly complex message from Luke 16, the parable of the shrewd steward, if you will. We'll talk about that maybe as a way to take a complex message and make it simple. Um, but Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, he's in the news a lot right now because of the documentary that exists over his work. But there's a neat thing that he did that he's credited with in the process of synthesizing a message to an audience that was predominantly preschool. And so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I linked the article in the comments, so if folks want to see it. But very simply, when he was putting together a scene or a conversation or a song, they would do things as simple as this. State the idea as clearly as you want in words or terms that a preschool child can understand. And so, like the example given in the article is, it's dangerous to play in the street. Well, so you always wanted to switch it to a positive because it met its context. So it's good to play where it's safe. And then keep working the phrase over, trying to make it fit the audience that they had selected. That means that his audience may have kids who didn't have parents, kids who were in troubled homes, kids who had perfect homes, all that. And so he would try to find a way, because he was working with preschoolers, so that they would get what he wanted them to know and that they would want to know it. Um, we, in essence, need to be mindful of doing the same thing. And Terry and I can probably both commiserate on this point. We haven't always done that. There's lots of factors that destroy the effectiveness of your message. Some of it's structural, some of it's attitude, some of it's not knowing what you need to say in a clear way. So you can take that concept that from that article and just change it up a little bit and say, this is my audience. My audience is age 83 to age 13, let's say. Okay, that means that's the word basket I can pull from. I can't use stuff that they're not going to be benefiting from, and as a group on a regular basis. I may choose to, and one of the things that I intentionally choose to do is to use idioms, catchphrases, and terms that are relevant to those demographics. So sometimes I use the language of the 60 and up crowd, and sometimes I'll use the language of the 25 and under crowd, because I want to, and I'll do what I do with other words, and I'll repeat it a few different ways.
Right.
So,
You put in the context of the triad again. It's three different things, but you not only say it three different ways, but you target three demographics in the way you're saying it.
right.
And that may be, by the way, demographics, when you look at demographics from that standpoint, which is something that I probably tune in too much to, it's more than just age. Because when I think about demographics, I think about age, I think about education, I think about gender, I think about race, I think about blue collar versus white collar worker. You can vary those triads in all of those different ways. Student versus employed versus retired, single, married, widowed. You can think about it in all those demographics depending on what you're talking about. And you can change the legs of that three-pronged triad. You can change all of that in a way that actually is effective to reach different groups. So we do that. My Alexa, stop. Sorry about that. So we just want to make sure that we look at that way. If you're not using triads in your sermons, by the way, you're missing the great opportunity to be able to make things simple. That's, to me, the most effective way. You and I both mentioned that twice now. That is, if you're not doing that and you want some help with that, you could talk to Phil or myself. That absolutely is crucial to your outlining.
Outlining, by the way, you don't have to if you don't like to do full manuscripts, you don't have to, but you can outline these repetitive ideas so that you know you're hitting these three key sections. And so that's something that's really important to do. Another thing that's really important is to understand your audience on the other side of this, that they're going to be coming to the assemblies and coming to the Bible class at a different point spiritually than maybe you are in this process. You've spent 40 hours crafting your teaching and sermons for the week, let's say. We'll use that. They've spent 40 hours doing whatever it is that they do to provide for their families. And then in the other hours, and I'm just using those as illustrations time-wise, obviously that's not realistic. And so you're trying to make sure that all that stuff you've learned this week, you've now boxed it in a way that they're going to grow from it. And Terry and I both I know that we probably have different edges to this, but we do have a unified idea, is that the preaching is to mature the adults in the audience to a certain degree. The preaching is not so much for the kids. And yet we still want those who have a childlike understanding to get as much out of it as someone who is a deep, rich Bible student. Again, remember, communication of biblical ideas is stupid hard. It just is. And there's no way to get around that. So that means you need to package up these big complex ideas in smaller segments in a way that will reach those goals. And so you're trying to break down a message into sustainable sections. And again, that may mean, like I said before, you study a ton about the language and the Greek, and you never actually explicitly refer to it in the sermon. But you're teaching people language principles in the course of it, in the same way that you probably should never diagram a sentence in a sermon. But knowing how to diagram a sentence is a powerful language tool and a linguistic tool. We'll pause right here. We're about halfway through our conversation. If you guys have questions about specifics that you want to kind of break down, this is also a great time to ask questions, interject, give better advice than Terry and I have. We're not the experts. We just have certain levels of gray hair available to us. So
let me jump in and add something about, we kind of mentioned this. You said you don't have to write a manuscript, and you don't, but I will say you have to actually plan and prepare how you're going to take what you're teaching and make it ready in a way that is effective. And I'm just going to be blunt about this. If you get up and you only write down about a half a page of notes, with mainly your main thought in Scripture, and then you're just going to fill in the gaps with some kind of ad lib type stuff that you make up on the spot. That is not effective planning to make this delivery effective. And I've been preaching over 20 years. Phil's been preaching that long. I still to this day, it's not a manuscript in the fact that it's in paragraph format. It is an outline, but in my outlines that are sometimes 10 pages long plus, I try to write out every word I'm going to say. And the reason that it is that I write out every word. I craft every sentence with triads and transitions and all this stuff we've been talking about, so that there's no guesswork about whether I'm reaching all of these different groups. I sit down with a purpose to say, okay, I got to make this in such a way that this person, this person, this person, and this person grasp what it is. And sometimes I think about different skill levels or maybe specific people. I mean, look, the reality is I don't necessarily preach to young kids, but I've had babes in Christ who, from a purely knowledge level, knew less than some of our second graders who were sitting in the same auditorium. And they're an adult. And I've got to preach to them to strengthen them. And so all of that only occurs when you actually plan and prepare how you're going to say things.
Yeah.
And that, I always use the example of the president, regardless of which president it is. Let me throw that out there. They pay guys thousands of dollars to write those speeches and to make sure they're crafted in the way that is received the best politically. And a lot of times some of those speechwriters fail at that, okay, admittedly.
Yeah.
What I do every Sunday, what Phil does every Sunday, in that 30 to 45-minute block, whatever it is way more important than any political speech that's ever been presented. Because a political speech is not going to save anybody's soul, but I might say something that and the hope is that I say something in a way that gets somebody to change their life and submit to Jesus. Why would I not put as much effort into what I say every week as people do into stuff that means far less? And so that may be one of my soapboxes, but I don't think you can do this without a ton of preparation, including thinking about how you're going to say something, planning how you're going to say something, writing it down so you say it in the right way. That's what has to be done.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's almost as good as the baby coming into the conversation. This is the best episode ever right now. It's not going to get any better.
Only if I was eating a taco.
Oh, that would improve things significantly. So I'll add this. I don't use manuscripts, but my outlines vary in length from 9 to 20, 30 pages. Those outlines include graphics at times. They'll include illustrations and note drawings where I've drawn things out so I can remember key tie-in points. And so that's consistent for me. And those outlines also include specific, say it only this way, dummy head type moments where this is the way I'm supposed to say it a certain way. Keith makes it.
Don't read from the outline. That's a whole other episode, but don't read from it.
Yeah. Keith makes a great point that I want to extend a little bit. He writes it towards his 13-year-old son. Two things about when we talk about 13-year-old as our kind of age bracket. 13-year-olds are not like whether those 13-year-old kids are dumb. 13-year-olds are brilliant. They're in middle school, so they're being crushed every day by social stresses and emotional stresses and life changes. But academically, they're starting to reach the peak of their reading level. They have great listening potential if you're willing to help them grow to it. And for many folks, that's where their reading level settles back out at. You know, unless they go into white collar academia, their reading level kind of goes back to that 8th to 11th grade reading range and listening range. And so writing to the 13-year-old really is writing to the largest audience in the sense of their ability to retain and glean. That may not be the case in every congregation. I know in certain groups, because of what the industry is around there, maybe you got a lot of academics, maybe you have a lot of professionals, and so your group is going to have a different dynamic to it, and maybe you want to be a little bit aware of it. Um, but even so, these are the kind of the background principles that you need to kind of employ if you want a message that meets the intention. And here's another way to think about it. Terry talks about the importance of the message. Preachers often stress that we really want you to invite your friends to hear the gospel. Um, if you're telling your congregation you want them to be good inviters, and you should, then the message you bring to those invitations should be equivalent to your desires. Like, I want everyone here. Every single sermon I put together, I really want it to be the one that is the best. This is the best one I've done. And there's a big draw to all of those. And I'll double down with Terry. If you get up there with your notes and your notes are on a 3x5 card, you're amazing. If you can communicate really well and do that, that's awesome. I know I can't meet my goals doing that. I can't be the kind of effective speaker that I want to do. And it's possible that maybe you're overestimating your abilities in that area. Maybe you're just thinking that you're good at riffing it. And maybe you are for a little while, but eventually it'll catch up to you. Eventually the well will run dry, and there'll be some consequences to your effectiveness.
Absolutely.
It is Tuesday, Terry, so tacos need to be part of the equation. I think you're being called out there.
Well, we'll see. I mean, the day is young. I would not doubt that could be part of the day.
Yeah.
But
So,
I will say I've had Tuesdays. I have tacos for 2 days in a row, so I'm on a good run so far.
right. I'll just say, admittedly, tacos are an all the time thing as what goes down for me, and everyone should know that by now. So let me add a couple more things. We've got a couple good comments. I'll bring those in a second. We've another thing that takes place. We spent a little bit of time talking about complex, making it simple. And by the way, that includes picking your quotes. And if you're going to quote someone from an academic, make sure you quote somebody who's an understandable academic.
Yeah,
I think about it.
If I could quote N.T. Wright or Mr. Rogers, I'm always going Mr. Rogers.
Well, we know that about you.
Yeah, but I've used that because, and again, this is where we can't get out of our own way. When we go to lectures here in a little bit, there'll be some names thrown around with quotes, and to you and I, that'll mean something. But some of those names that are thrown around with quotes mean nothing to the guy that delivers mail Monday through Friday, with the exception of Clay Gentry.
Yeah, he's probably listening or watching. So
yeah, so I mean, and I think, okay, I'm going to say it this way. Sometimes I think we try to impress people with what we know. That goes back to the Greek. That goes back to even the quotes. Sometimes we just want to kind of go, well, I read so-and-so. And I mean, just be careful about all of that, because a lot of times you make things way too difficult to follow doing that.
And you may unintentionally end up coming off as arrogant,
yes,
know-it-all. And that's not what you're desiring. And most guys don't feel that way about themselves. They just kind of get into this zone of, well, let me just unload all the information that's in my head. I think about it this way. I want those quotes to challenge me, but not to be challenging to understand. And that's the way I think about if I'm going to use a quote, historical, modern, whatever. I want it to challenge me, but not be challenging to understand. And
right.
That's for quotes, but really the message as a whole. By the way, Scott, Terry and I both use iPads as well. At least he used to. I don't know if he still is. I'm still using my multi-year-old iPad mini.
I have a newer iPad. I upgraded. I had the first one, then I went to the first mini, and now I have the first regular iPad that could use a pencil. But that means I don't upgrade until like every 5 years.
Right.
And if you're going to write, they say it this way: if you're going to write sermons as that are as long outline format as we do, then you're going to have to stop killing all the trees. So,
Yeah.
the iPad has been fantastic. So.
Right. This mini is multi-years old. It's adopted from one of my kids that used it, and then they shifted to using something else, and so it'll get used until it can't use anymore.
Yeah.
So the other thing is about not taking things that are simple and thinking we've got to make them complex. And we get caught up in that. Like Terry and I are both visual guys. That's one thing that we share in our work, is that I think a quality visual is important. And we kind of use similar mechanics in the process of getting to that visual, but not the process is a little bit different. But sometimes we get lost and thinking we've got this great visual thing going in our head, and all those visuals get in the way. Just in the same way as Terry talks about, and here's the thing for me. Terry talks about how, like, when someone starts going off into the Greek, he kind of shuts down. Years ago, I used to put all of my visuals on the internet. All my PowerPoint stuff used to go online. And Friday through Sunday morning, those downloads would just skyrocket. People would be grabbing my visuals off the table and they'd start using them. Awesome. Loved it. And then I went to gospel meetings where I saw some of my stuff used. And I'm like, that's not what I planned for it to do. I didn't have any of that going on. Why'd you do all those flippy crazy things? Why'd you take off my flippy crazy things?
Yeah.
And I got so distracted because I was caught up in the visual or the misuse of the visual and forgot to pay attention to the message. And I think that happens sometimes on the delivery side too, where we use visual aids, we use other stuff, we come up with structures that we want to use to teach a message, and we've taken something that's a pretty simple text, and now we've just destroyed it because we wanted it to fit our 15-point series or whatever. And I want to encourage folks to be careful with that. If God took the time to craft a message for every man, and he expresses it in 3 sentences in one part in the Bible, bro, let it be. You don't need to reinvent that to relate to people. And I think that's a strong value point to take home. If it's already simple, leave it that way. Leave it the way that the scriptures designed it in that regard. At least that's for me. Terry, I don't know if you've had similar experiences that way, but.
Let me say this. I think that as a whole, the Bible is easier to understand than we often want to make it. And the reason I say that way is I'm afraid sometimes we complicate things for the sake of job security. And you don't have to do that. And let the passage speak for itself, especially when it is so easy to understand. There are times where I'll read something and I go, I don't know that there needs to be a lot of commentary on that. I think that's pretty easy to understand. Just let the scriptures speak for themselves on a lot of this stuff. Don't make it so hard. That's really my thought on that. And we all do that. I think we all complicate issues sometimes. And there's not a need for it. It's different when you need to address a need. I'll use this as an example. When it comes to baptism, which is just a foundational understanding that we have, you can talk about baptism in probably a more simple way than sometimes we do. You can just explain baptism is immersion, and you can show passages which show that it's immersion, and you can talk about that. You don't have to go into this collection of different interpretations and all that kind of stuff. Now, there's a time and place for that, but not the way sometimes we do that. We can make it too confusing, too complex. Just let it be simple, and I don't know. Maybe that's all I need to say about that. Toss it back to you, but that's just how I feel about that.
Well, here's some other stuff to think about. I mentioned Luke 16 earlier, and I want to kind of re-engage back in that text. There's a surface level reading of the text that most people kind of look at and they kind of struggle with. Luke 16 is a parable of the dishonest minister, the shrewd steward, however you want to think about it. And sometimes we look at that text and we read the surface level as a modern believer and we go, oh, this is about making sure we maximize our investments and, get this, squeeze every last penny out of stuff. And then we forget to listen to it in a way that catches the edges of the audience that heard it. And almost exclusively in the context of the Israelite world, when you talk about masters and servants, you're talking about God and Israel. And so instantly they know who the master is, they know who the steward is. And this is not a parable about maximizing profit. It's really more a parable about how the Pharisees are responding to the trust that God has given them about Israel, and how here's an opportunity for them to invest in the kingdom and then they're not. There's some other layers to it. But here, that's the thing, because we've got two layers to a message in the text here. We've got a simple layer that we tend to hang out on the surface. We got a complex layer that really is probably the best understanding to the text. But that brings us to a problem. How do we then derive an application out of the text? Because
and Phil, let me
does
add
that make
this.
sense?
In the context too, we also let this get us hung up about money, and the money is really the illustration to talk about loyalty and commitment in the context, because this is where he says you can't serve two masters. Okay.
Yeah.
You can't serve God and money, and you can substitute anything else into that slot of money. He says money because of the context and because of the application there. But that parable, even at its deepest layer, is not just about financial planning. It is about being faithful stewards of everything, and you can't serve yourself and God at the same time.
Right.
And that's the ultimate application of that. And when you get so focused in on the story that's being told rather than the application that's being made, you completely miss the point of that.
Right. This is the point where I think we can kind of make that jump from like complex to simple, and application. I think that's why I think it's a great passage for this, because what, like Terry and I are talking about, you get distracted by it. And so now you got to say, well, how do I do that? How do I take a text that, and there's some complexities like in verse 9, who are we talking about, etc. Is this talking about heaven, all that stuff? Here's something to think about. We've got to first study the text like in a practical way and get all those complexities sorted out. And then find a mechanism to take our audience, ages 13 to 80, and help them sit at the feet of Jesus. So let's say I'm going to teach this text, and this is the application side. This is kind of what I think is important. Maybe it answers Bob's question too, and it kind of pulls the academia off of the table. First thing I want to do is do everything I can to get my audience into the feet of the people present when Jesus was talking. So my introduction is really going to be heavily on developing the ears of Israel. And that's probably where I would start with. And then the middle of the section is really going to be mainly reading the text and bringing out the parts that Jesus is connecting to the questions he just heard, or he's hearing in advance, like he knows the hearts of the people. And so I'll highlight those things either by how I read or how I break up the reading. And then we get the application. Remember that parables aren't short moralistic truths where he's like, these are like little, things that have the moral, they're not fables.
That's what we turn them into, is fables, but they're not fables.
He makes his application sometimes in private, sometimes right afterwards, sometimes by saying, and this is you, So in the application phase, I'm going to have done those two steps. So now my audience and I are in the feet of Israel. Our ears are like the Israelite ears. We're listening to Jesus teach. King Jesus is proclaiming the message to us. And then, okay, but I'm a 21st century Christian. Has anything changed? Well, maybe I need to change. And so maybe that's my application. Well, maybe the world around us has changed. And yes, the world is different in some ways than it was in the first century. And so in those two areas, I've got to make a sensible application where I maybe have navigated complex to simple, but when someone walks out of the building, at least for Sunday, and maybe for the week that follows, they can live like Jesus in a more holistic, strong, healthy, complete way. So that, I mean, that's what we've kind of been getting at in the conversation. And again, communication is stupid hard. So to do that effectively, it takes a lot of work and a lot of study and a lot of preparation. Neil's comment here, he says the text is usually not the problem, it's the application where we fail. And I think that's probably some level of truth there. We want to make our applications before we've read the text, is one of the things that come up.
Yeah, I recently helped my son develop his first sermon, and the story that he picked to preach from and the applications he made. I've done some internships, and I've talked to one of the guys that I worked with, and he's still friends with my son, and said, you may want to check on him, because I went in and said, hey, this first half of the outline where you tell the story is really good. You did a really good job with that. The second half of your sermon where you make application is complete and utter garbage. You got to throw it away and start all over. And he looked at me with like that horror/disgust, and he didn't understand. And I said, because you took this text and you made generic applications you wanted to make without really making them from the text. Some of the things you say aren't even in the text to begin with. And so in the process of that, we worked through that. And one of the activities was to show him, here's actually what the text, in this case, it was a story. Here's actually what the story is saying. Here's some actual applications from the text you can make. And I think a lot of times we do, I don't know, we used to call them, I think when I was training with Wilson Adams, he called them concordant sermons, where you come up with what you want to say and then you search the concordance for the passages that fit. And that's, as a general rule, is a very immature way to prepare. It is far better to just go break down the text, like you said, put yourself in the feet, listen. So all that is context. Understand the context of the culture, understand the context of the text, put all that in its setting, look at what happens, and then go back and actually look at what applications are in the context of that. Some of those are so layered and so deep. And sometimes you have to choose which applications to make. I think I have 8 sermons from the parable of the prodigal son.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because that section is got so much depth, which, by the way, is the setup to what we just talked about in Luke 16. When you talk to Luke 16, you got to look at all that context. So, so again, I think Neil brings out a good point about the application. That we sometimes put it somewhere, it just doesn't. It's not where it's supposed to be at. That's just not the intent at all.
Yeah, I think also, like, on this whole realm, Sunday we began a series in Galatians, and so I did Galatians 1 through 10. It's just a simple breakout of the text. It'll take all year long. And one of the members came after me, says, that wasn't what I was expecting from the text. Like, the parts that you brought out, because I was also introducing the whole book, those weren't ones that I was expecting. I jokingly said, well, Jesus was really good at subverting expectations, and so I just try to do that. But more practically, I think that's what we need to do. The scriptures are rich. There are multiple layers to the text. But if we stay in the text, then we're going to have a better outcome long run. Do not underestimate your audience's ability to be interested in what God says if you're actually teaching them what God has said. One more thing to kind of connect to that. One of the reasons I read the particular things that I read is to accomplish the goal of getting into the mindset of the audience that Jesus interacts with. And the mindset that God interacted with back in the Old Covenant era, in the time of the patriarchs, in the time of the Mosaic Law, and the time of captivity, in the Second Temple Israel time frame, and so on. I want to get a good picture of that. And so I read stuff that helps me know that so I can teach the text. So again, kind of summarizing what we've been talking about, if you're dealing with something complex, your goal then should be to make it as simple as you can make it. Not as simple as Terry can make it, not as simple as I can make it. Use your skills to your advantage and know your audience so they understand it. If it's simple, keep it there. If it was simple to begin with, then make sure that the outcome of your sermon, it's still simple. And it's what God intended in that process as well. And then your applications should really be the flowers from the text. They should really be growing from the soil that you've dug up and you've matured in that lesson, and now they've grown to fruition. Some different ways to think about that are really important, but I think it's a powerful concluding concept is to really make sure your applications are inherent to what God was telling the people.
And make sure your applications actually apply, and are practical. We didn't really,
Right. That may be a whole other thing.
Yeah, if you don't give me an application that actually can make my life better, it doesn't help me at all. An effective preaching should always leave every listener with some kind of challenge that they can work on and become better. Every sermon should give some nugget of somewhere where my understanding, my practice, my behavior, something I can do better. Help me to do better. So you got to make those applications practical. They got to be somewhat direct, easy to understand, no confusion. That may be a whole nother discussion, but you got to think about all of those things when you talk about application.
All right, so we're at 52 minutes in. We have no idea what time means to us anymore. We've lost sense of reality, and so now it's time for us to take a break and do other things for a week at least. But I do want to make mention of a couple things. Terry and I will both be in Tampa in February, first week of February. I've got another visitor coming on down, so that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
But we'll be in Tampa in February, and we will want to encourage folks, if you're going to be there on Monday, Terry and I are going to find a suitable location. And if folks want to come have lunch with us, we'd love to chat with you in person a little bit. Location is to be determined, but it'll be about Monday at 12 o'clock Eastern time. Is that what we're thinking?
Yeah, somewhere around there.
Somewhere around there, but we'll figure out a location. Guerrilla marketing campaign will ensue as we tag up the entire campus. And in the process of all of that, we really hope that these things we've done over the last year have been encouraging, but we'd like to be encouraged by you in person. And feel free to talk to us when we're wandering around campus. Don't be confused if you see younger version of ourselves on campus. That's not us. They look similar but not the same.
Mine's shorter and has more hair, so he doesn't look like
he behaves in similar ways, though. If you listen for him, it feels like it's the same thing. But we'll be there. And so we want to encourage you to kind of be with us there. Coming up for this year, some things to look forward to. Matt Harbour, who is currently studying in Israel and finishing up some doctoral work, is going to join us on air. Dylan Cornwell, who works as an HR professional, is going to talk about benefits for preachers with us. He's got a heritage connecting the gospel preachers. And a few others are going to come in here soon and talk about some related things to the work of evangelism. Also, we're still open and wanting to hear about your questions, your comments, things that you want us to talk about are perfectly fine. Terry, any last things you want to make mention of before we sign off here?
No, I just, like they say, we're going to be in Florida during that week, and it'd be great to spend some time with some of the people, especially some of you that we've never met. If you're going to be down there, that'd be fantastic. So just Monday around noon, lunchtime, and that'll give us time to hang out and talk and whatever. Send us your send us your questions. We'd love to have them.
All right, everybody. You all have a great day and take care.